If you could hear, at every jolt, the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest, to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. These lines, taken from a poem by Wilfred Owen, describe a soldier suffocated by poisonous gas. Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori is Latin for the idea that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's own country. In Owen's view, the First World War made a mockery of this belief. When the young men of Europe's major nations marched into battle in the summer of 1914, few could have imagined what lay in wait for them. Many, believing war to be a place of heroism and honour, were in for a rude awakening. What almost no one realised in 1914 was that the nature of war had changed in a fundamental way. We saw in the previous video how new technologies created a stalemate on the Western Front. The combination of machine guns, artillery and barbed wire made it almost impossible to successfully invade an enemy's trench. One of the most important reasons for this stalemate on the Western Front was new technology, and in this video we will be taking a closer look at this technology, focusing on weapons. The most basic reason that trenches were necessary in the first place was because of the introduction of powerful new weapons. One such weapon, the machine gun, was probably more important than any other in contributing to the stalemate. The questions we want to ask here are: why were weapons so effective in the First World War, and how did they contribute to the stalemate on the Western Front? Secondly, how did these weapons change during the war? And thirdly, which of these weapons was most effective? Firstly, why were weapons so much more powerful in 1914? The fundamental reason is because of changes in technology. Specifically, changes created by the Industrial Revolution. In the 150 years before the First World War, several countries, most notably Great Britain, had made huge advances in science and technology. The result was new methods of manufacturing and a number of incredible inventions. The steam engine, electrical motor and internal combustion engine changed the world forever. In the world of business, powerful technologies meant higher profits, but in the world of conflict, powerful technologies meant more deadly weapons. The problem was that warfare from 1914 to 1918 became industrialized, and this meant that weapons were manufactured on a much larger scale. 150 years of scientific and technological progress was put towards war. Machine guns, heavy artillery, and barbed wire were a lethal combination for the attacking side. Charging head-on at the enemy was simply too risky. For the first years of the war, the best form of attack was defence, and the best defence was to dig a trench. For years, all Europe's military leaders could do was fight a war of attrition. In 1915, the head of the British Army, Earl Kitchener, said, "I don't know what is to be done, but this isn't war." So let's take a look at the weapons of trench warfare and see if we can understand what Kitchener meant. Machine guns. It's hard to overstate the importance of the machine gun. These guns were without doubt one of the most effective weapons of trench warfare, and they changed the way the war was fought. The rate at which a machine gun could fire, up to 10 bullets a second, meant that they could wipe out an entire line of soldiers in moments. Of the 200,000 men the French lost in the first 2 weeks of the war, a majority were casualties of machine gun fire. Barbed wire. Although not traditionally thought of as a weapon, barbed wire was highly effective as a means of stopping the enemy. Barbed wire had originally been invented in 1874 by an American farmer. It was designed simply as a means of keeping livestock from escaping from their fields. But during the war, barbed wire was repurposed for the trenches. It isn't as obvious why barbed wire was so effective, but when you take a look at images of trenches, you can see that they pose a formidable challenge. Artillery. Artillery, the name we give to the larger guns that fired over great distances, was another highly effective choice of weapon. The biggest of all these was developed by the Germans. Nicknamed Big Bertha, it was capable of firing a shell that weighed more than the average man, over 100 kilometers away. Artillery's effectiveness was due less to their accuracy than their power. When an artillery shell exploded, it released thousands of small pieces of metal, known as shrapnel, and these explain why an estimated 60% of casualties during the war were caused by exploding artillery. Gas. One of the most terrifying military developments of the war was chemical gas. In April 1915, a number of specialist German soldiers released a wave of gas towards French soldiers. The French soldiers, having never experienced this before, had no defence and no gas masks, and many suffocated to death. Although considered a barbaric weapon, chemical gas was gradually used by all the major parties. Gas was not a particularly reliable weapon, however, because its direction depended upon the wind. It could just as easily blow towards your own soldiers as towards your enemy. But it did have a powerful psychological effect on soldiers. It was a terrifying and silent way of attacking the enemy and could have hideous consequences. Individual soldiers were typically equipped with a rifle fitted with a bayonet. They might also have had grenades and a pistol. Rifles were the most common weapon of the First World War. Reliable and accurate, capable of firing at a target almost 600 metres away, rifles were the bread and butter of each army. For closer combat, grenades, small handheld explosives, could be thrown towards the enemy, and these could be effective, but as they were thrown by hand, you had to be close to the enemy. As the stalemate of trench warfare became clear, all sides were desperate to work out a way that you might break this deadlock. It was new technology that had created the stalemate in the first place, but it was also technology that would help break it. Two developments here are particularly important: the aeroplane and the tank. The very first aeroplane had only been developed 11 years before the outbreak of war. As a recent invention, these planes were incredibly basic. Needing to be light, the first planes used in the war were constructed of cloth, wood and piano wire. Their use at first was largely to gather information on what was happening behind enemy lines. Given the static nature of trench warfare, it was highly advantageous to be able to fly over the enemy's trenches and see what they were up to. This could anticipate a major offensive that might otherwise be hidden. As the war went on, however, planes were used as fighters and bombers. Fighter planes would engage the enemy in the air. Eventually, machine guns were attached to the front of these aircrafts, allowing them to enter into dogfights. A dogfight was a battle between planes where each plane would attempt to shoot the other one down. The pilots engaged in these conflicts had one of the most dangerous jobs in the war, and that is saying something. The average life expectancy for a pilot in 1916 was just 3 weeks. In the last 2 years of the war, planes were used to drop increasingly large bombs onto enemy trenches. These planes, capable of travelling deep into enemy territory, even bombed civilian towns and cities. By the war's end, there were more than 10,000 aircraft in action, and in total more than 50,000 airmen lost their lives during the war. Tanks, although much more commonly associated with the Second World War, were invented in the First. In September 1916, the British introduced tanks onto the battlefield for the first time. Like aircraft, because tanks were a new invention, they were less effective at first. Heavily armoured and capable of providing both a form of defence and attack, tanks did have the potential to break the stalemate of trench warfare. The problem, however, was that these early British tanks were slow, unreliable, and easy to break down. Overall, it is debatable as to how effective tanks actually were in the First World War. It really wasn't until the Second World War that tanks began to play a crucial role. Okay, once again, a lot of information to take in. Warfare was very different from 1914 to 1918. and improvements in technology made weapons more deadly than ever. These weapons, in particular the machine gun and artillery, gave great advantages to the defending side, and this made digging for trenches absolutely critical for survival. As the war went on, it became necessary to create new technologies, such as tanks and aeroplanes, in order to try and break the deadlock. It would take over 4 years, but eventually these technologies would help break the stalemate on the Western Front, and we will explore this issue in greater detail in future videos. Here are a few questions for you to have a go at answering. Why was warfare so different in 1914? Why were the weapons so much deadlier? How did weapons and technology contribute to the stalemate on the Western Front? Which weapons were the most effective? And how did weapons change during the war?